I'm really thrilled to be here. I've been in London for almost 5 years now. We did this. I know Alejandro because we did this in London at SICCS when I moved here the first time to build some community. We did it a second year too. Maria also, she came to both of those. First as presented as an alumnus talk. It's an incredible network. And actually, like I co-organized that with Joshua Becker at UCL School of Management. And he and I were actually the very first SICCS at Princeton in 2017 with Chris Bale and Matt Stalganic. So it's like, I've met so many great people through this community. I know you guys have been here for all of like 5 hours. So maybe you're starting to feel this vibe, but like it hopefully will build and like, you meet people you'll see the rest of your careers, and so I really hope you enjoy these 2 weeks. I'm honored to kick it off for you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a research project that has it's been a long journey, not quite 2017, but 2019 actually. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we put that together. And actually last week we found out it's finally like 100% accepted, not just conditionally accepted to management science. So we're very excited about that. With some colleagues of mine from my time in my postdoc. Ariella Crystal, she's a PhD at Columbia now. Haley is a assistant professor in Washington, D.C. Ashley's still at HBS. Yeomans now at Google. She went to tech. And then Georgie and Hannah, we were the behavioral insights team. They were our industry partners. So I'm going to talk about this is an interesting project because it combines a lot of things that I'm excited about. There's psychology, there's economics, there's field experiments, there's natural language processing, like a hint of networks, more so in the follow-up paper than what I'll talk about today. But it kind of, I think, speaks to the spirit of SICCS. Hopefully gives you a sense of like what's possible. Here we go. I should probably explain a little bit about myself. That doesn't quite work. Oh, maybe I have to just be closer. Okay, so this is a Canadian accent. I want to make clear. And my undergrad was all in psychology. I was doing like neuroscience, which is very interesting to learn about, but not fun to do. And what really changed my heart was going to Chicago and learning economics at the Booth School of Business. Understanding that like having interesting theories in the lab is fun if you want to prove how smart you are to people, but like those theories can actually make a big difference out in the world. And so running field experiments, getting people to like invest in environmental technologies, to donate to fundraising organizations for charities and nonprofits. That really showed the power of the ideas, right? This was kind of in the wake of Nudge. Obama had just been elected. We were very sort of optimistic about the power of ideas to change the world. And I still think that's true. There's been a few hiccups along the way, but these things have been accepted more and more. We were doing projects. My first year graduate student project, I was standing out at the gas stations in Chicago with a clipboard trying to get people to fill up their car tires with air pressure in like 90-degree sun, like covered in tire grease and smelling gas fumes. What really changed my career actually was when I did my postdoc at Harvard and MIT. First with Sendemol and Nathan, and then at HBS. I was working online education too, but the transition there was like, I was excited about field experiments and making a difference out in the real world. Like, we get all this public funding. We really want to pay it back to the people who are supporting us, who allow us to have these weird, nutty jobs where we get to sort of drift through the day and have our own ideas and pursue our passions. Standing out at the gas station is a lot of work. But I realized with the sort of like the computational social science of it all, right? This was back in it's like 2015. Machine learning was still very new, but the idea is if you're good with data, people will just give you their data. You don't have to go out and collect it and get dirty. If you're better at using their data than they are, right? And so almost everything I do now is some combination of data I've gotten from corporations, or I'll show you some data working with the British government. Pairing that with understanding of the lab experiments and the field experiments, but working with observational data, working with messy, custom or ready-made data is the Stalganic phrase, right? Instead of custom-made data. And that combination, I think, is what allows us to really understand things better and to make a difference. So, all right. So I mostly study conversations, how people talk to one another. Everywhere you go, people are talking to one another. And I like to think about all of our relationships as a series of conversations over time, right? And by the way, I know Alejandro said this is supposed to be less interactive. I would love questions along the way. It's much more conversational. So if we can't talk in this hour, please reach out later on too. You know, in every single relationship we have is a series of conversations, right? And so this is a first conversation, but Alejandro and I have had many conversations over time. I've met some of you before, and I'm still working with some of you. Hope to work with others of you in the future. Right? Often we think about relationships in terms of networks, but like, I'm going to be provocative and say that these are not real, right? These lines are like mathematical representations of relationships. What's in those edges, right? It's a whole bunch of conversations, people talking to each other, right? And how those relationships are built and formed and broken and rearranged. That's the stuff I'm interested in, how people get along. And people talk for all kinds of reasons. The conversational goal I'm going to talk about today is advice. And a lot of people think about advice in terms of decisions they're going to make, right? Like, so you get recommendations on Amazon, maybe you get a financial analyst and telling you what mortgage you want to take out for your first home. You know, a lot of psychologists will look at like judgment. So you get advice on forecasting, right? You're trying to guess, you know, who's going to win a Premier League match. Right, you're trying to guess some historical date, some factual knowledge. You get someone else's opinion to form a belief about some future state or some unknown quantity. Big in finance too, right? Forecasting. But I'm going to talk about a kind of advice that matters a lot, which is like fundamental to, I think, the project of SICCS and fundamental to all of our careers, which is performance advice. Right, the kind of feedback we get from our mentors, the kind of feedback we give to our mentees, right, our proteges. You know, an organization like this, like we're all learning from each other. Hopefully you guys are learning from each other in this group, but you're learning from people. Yeah, I'm probably the most junior person you'll have along here, but there'll be some senior people who can give you some really good advice. You know, now that I have PhD students, I take the advice I give them really seriously. And that's a lot more complicated than the advice we get for a forecast, right? When we're trying to predict what the stock market will do 6 months from now. We're just trying a point estimate, maybe a distribution of beliefs, right? It's complex, it's messy, it comes in unstructured natural language, right? There's all kinds of relational goals that interfere with our giving of advice, right? But this is the kind of stuff that like makes careers meaningful, right? And like the advice I've received and the advice I've given over the years is like the kind of stuff that is the tentpole of like why I like this career. And hopefully you guys like it too. So how do we measure this kind of advice? Well, we're going to try and get to that. This is like OB theory, which is a little dry. So I'm going to skip through all of that. But the important point is that like a lot of organizations care a lot about advice. They care about developing people within the group. And often the managers are supposed to give advice to one another. The problem is when you let people decide endogenously whether to seek out advice, then only the people who are like most extroverted or most helpful or most friendly end up getting that advice. And so it's a bit of a rich gets richer phenomenon, right? So they actually have formal structures in place where everyone's supposed to get advice. It's purely focused on development in the professional context. So I don't know, how many, can a quick show of hands, how many of you have actually been in industry before? Great, glad you're here, I'm sorry. And then again, so how many of you have done a 360 peer review? Is that okay, we got a few. Much less enthusiastic hands, I can tell. It's not a fun process, but it exists to encourage people to get better advice from one another. So I'll talk to you about some of the details. We're actually going to run a field experiment in a 360 peer review. And the goal there is I will name everyone I work with. So my mentor, my direct reports, and then a couple of peers. And then all of those people will then give me performance advice on how well I've done over the past year and what I could work on better. And so and people spend a lot of time on this, but the reviews in the literature, Avi Kluger in Denisi is the best review of this, but there's a few others, show that people are in fact not very good at giving this advice. Even when you set aside a whole day of the year, specifically for developmental feedback, you get a lot of waffle, a lot of like empty platitudes and nonsense. People don't take it seriously. And so the idea is conditional on choosing your, with your advisor being fixed, right? The timing of the advice being fixed. Are there ways to improve the quality of that advice in the language itself? And so the literature has really focused on this idea of actionability, right? That when we get advice, we want to be able to know what to do next to follow through on that advice to improve our performance. And that's messy and it's contextual and it's personal. There's a lot of interesting variables that go into that, right? But in general, if we can boil that down to one dimension that we can extract from this text, if we think about it as being more actionable, then we can think about it as being better. And there's a lot of lab and field data suggesting that those are at least somewhat correlated. And we're going to validate that in our study later. So, right, we're going to think about this from an organizational point of view, right? We are managers in control of an organization. We have time carved out for developmental feedback. So how do we get people to make that feedback more actionable? Okay, and I'm going to give you, okay, so here's some sample feedback. This is actually from our data. We've anonymized the names, so these are not real names, but so when you read text, I think you can get a sense of what's less actionable or not. So here, these are less actionable texts, right? So, well, I don't fully buy this, or think it's exactly what Megan does. Is something I don't feel she has methods of systematically overseeing all the areas when it gets too big. There's no doubt Harry lives and breathes collective leadership. He'll gravitate to lead when things get tough. But there's actually nothing for Harry to work on here. Like when you get this advice, this still feels very British to me. The more actionable stuff. Now, here's some example. Will and Kate, they're getting exactly the kind of information they need to know how to improve later, right? So Will needs to set up regular supervision sessions. Needs to talk to the team members and give me more feedback. Kate can delegate more. She gives more space to people to deliver before following up and monitoring, right? Yeah, question?
Yeah, Dr. Stroh, I was wondering the cultural context. What is the cultural context of your work as the American working in the UK? Like there's very different cultural norms about people.
Yes. How long have you been here?
Here.
Okay, you've been here longer than me.
Yeah, but
Oh, okay. I'm doing my indefinite right to remain this summer, so and it's a challenge. So the data the field data is we have. I'll spoil the punchline. The field data is the top like 20,000 or so senior civil service members across the entire UK government. So not like people like not members of parliament, people who are elected, but like basically everyone below them. But like I'm also gonna make sure. So we're gonna do randomized control trials. We're gonna manipulate our intervention. There's a question about generalizability, which is like, is it moderated by cultures? Does the manipulation work better in some cultures than others? I think it sounds like what you're talking about is a main effect, which is that British people are much less actionable in general than Americans.
I might read this as American and it's less actionable, but my British colleagues might read it and like actually know that they believe yes, that I just missing because I'm looking for practice more action, like literally say that.
Yeah, do we have any British people in the room who can translate for us? No. All right. That sounds about right. That's very London. So I mean, we're going to run experiments where people evaluate this, and we have like iterator reliability. I mean, this organization brought us in because of this specific problem, and I'll say also like we were helping them, and like part of the motivation was women in particular don't get actionable feedback in the workplace. This is something that we replicated in our data too, and I don't know that that's because that they have a better sense of intuiting what they're supposed to learn. Like they saw it as a fundamental problem. Like the gender equalities office brought us in because they thought that men and women deserve the same kind of treatment. And this is the kind of thing where like there's been a lot of research on why women's careers start off in different places, like related to negotiation and their first job offers. But when we think about the reasons why gender imbalances persist over a course of a career, inadequate mentorship is the kind of thing that we think might be a problem. And this is not a solution by any stretch. Like these 360 peer reviews are really a thin slice of those relationships. But I think hopefully I'll convince you, it's an unprecedented window into those kind of informal settings, these messy, unstructured settings, which is exactly where that kind of bias can occur. Now, I'll spoil the punchline and tell you, we designed an intervention to try and close the gap. We wanted an interaction with gender. It turns out we have two main effects. So we replicate that gender effect, and our intervention just made the feedback more actionable for everybody. So we have a second paper on the gender side that we're going to work on that maybe gets into the networking of it all that I'm not going to talk about much today. But, I think colloquially, there's a lot of research, both in our field context, but also in the broader literature, that this is a problem that needs to be addressed at the margin. I'm also willing to accept that you can be too direct, right? So, I have been told from for example, I think the Dutch culture is very direct. Israelis as well really kind of get to the point. So you can imagine, a bit of a tailing off at the higher end of the distribution, but at least at this part of the distribution, the problem seems to be that people aren't getting enough. So that's, yeah, but this is the beauty of field experiments, right? Is we need to keep testing these things out in the world, right? And the lab is one context, and the field is one of many different contexts, right? You have a question, Alejandro?
So I think the states that would make your results pretty quickly, because that would mean that the intervention is not providing much more guidance but really on their own. So that would mean that the effort that find the intervention is actually pretty conservative, because when only really relax, they eat British people who give really instructions, something more less action, things like let's say it will make results.
Thank you. Let me get into it. I'm spoiling the whole. I like that this is very nonlinear. So the later slides will go very quickly, but I do want to give you a bit more of the sense of what we're doing here. But I want to give you the example because we're going to do some NLP, and our NLP is going to be really old school. There's not going to be any LLMs. It's going to be like n-grams and lassos. And part of the reason I like focusing on that kind of stuff isn't just, the accuracy scores are solid. We validate with human coders, but also the interpretability, right? I don't want to just tell you that some algorithm knows what's going on, right? I want you to see it for yourself so you can understand it. And that's because as much as, and the interpretability part is partly a code thing, right? Like all of we pre-register everything. Even our cleaning code is on OSF and GitHub, right? But I have to go and teach this stuff to MBAs, and I promise you the MBAs are not going to be on GitHub, right? So we need to be able to show them shiny things with colors, right? To teach them how to be more actionable when they are out in the field too, right? Because it's not just about having ideas, it's about having impact. And humans are going to be managers for at least a couple more decades. So we need to help them, even if they don't understand the code. I want to walk, but I have to be here. Okay. So potential barriers. We're going to address some of this stuff. Why aren't people more actionable? Well, maybe there's relational concerns. Maybe they need a reminder, right? It's not a salient goal at the time. They're kind of filling out some forms at work. And then maybe they're focused in the past, right? They're trying to be specific, so they're focusing on problems in the past, but not thinking about what people need to do next, right? Which is a key component of actionability. The first study we actually were brought in, they ran an RCT where they gave a reminder to tell people to be more specific and concrete. And they didn't know how to analyze the data, so that's when they brought us in. And so they had this timely reminder where they said specific, please include concrete examples of what they could do to achieve this. And this is the behavioral insights team, so they know how to run our RCT. This actually made them less concrete, and people were less likely to fill out the form, right? So this is the intensive margin, but the extensive margin was even worse too. People it looked hard, so they just didn't want to do it. And when they tried, they didn't do a good job at it. So it's a more complicated psychological puzzle than simply reminding people to do what they need to do. So the punchline of this paper is you want people to give more actionable feedback on their pathway through their professional lives. Don't focus on the past, right? And the word feedback is inherently past focused, right? Instead, focus on the future. Tell them what they should do next. So simply changing the word from feedback to advice, focuses them on the future, the actions they need to take, and that makes their advice more useful, more helpful, and more actionable. So we're going to build an NLP algorithm that will measure actionability from text for our field experiment, because even if we had the budget to hire RAs to annotate 50,000 pieces of peer feedback advice, we don't have the raw text. So this is another thing about working with field partners, right? So we wrote all of our code that we sent to 10 Downing Street, and their engineers there then ran our code on their data and output the n-grams, but it had to be anonymized, right? Because a lot of people in our data are people who don't want to be in the newspaper any more than they already are, right? But so that complicated relationship means that we need to be able to write an algorithm that can look at that data without human eyes that people have to trust.
I know some people do air gapped analyses where you go in and you run stuff on their computer without your phone or anything like that. But we had them send some data, right? But it had to be anonymized first. And so we need the algorithm to be able to do that. But then we'll run lab experiments. We have humans that can rate the text too. Okay, so there's more theory. I'll skip the theory. I'll give you one of our lab studies. So we have people online. This is what we call like a artifactual field experiment. We're getting people who are real employees who have worked with somebody over the last couple of months off a prolific. So these are in context, but they know they're in a lab experiment. And so they're doing all kinds of interesting jobs out in industry. And so we're going to have some people do like a task specific, like give feedback for one thing that a recent employee did, or give feedback for their last 6 months. And then we're going to do this framing of feedback versus advice. And this is our manipulation in all our studies. We're just simply changing the word from feedback to advice, right? To focus people more on the future rather than the past. So people, these are the kind of feedback that people give. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just to make sure. I think you guys get the idea. But then we had raters. We had people, human raters, evaluate all the text. So they rated the comments that people gave on this scale of actionability. These three items that we average together. And what we see is that task-specific advice tends to be more actionable than holistic advice naturally, but we see this main effect across both settings, which is that it's a lot more actionable when we ask for advice rather than feedback, that one word change. It's also more constructive, more useful, more helpful. On all of these, we see significant effects. I think here we're averaging them all together. And it's because, for those of you who like the mediation triangles, I'm not going to get into all of that, but the mediation triangle works too. Because the people self-report caring more about the future when they're writing the advice, that is what leads to the actionability in the text and the usefulness and helpfulness. Lab studies. These are a lot cheaper. You can run a lot of them. So what else? Well, we had one with a control condition where we just asked for thoughts instead of advice for feedback. Thoughts is a lot like feedback. So it's not a feedback effect, it's an advice effect, right? Future focused feedback looks a lot like feedback. So you can't just tell the future folks, something about the feedback, it really anchors people on the past. We did studies when we had people give feedback to someone with like a messy cover letter. So a stranger, as well as somebody they knew in their workplace. We tried a couple different versions of that. We keep getting the same effect over and over again. Replication is nice. Okay, let's skip all this. Let's get to our field experiment. So that initial reminder study was one peer review date, 360 peer review we did, and then we developed some new interventions based on our lab studies and looking at their data. That's the other thing is like, if you spend a lot of time with companies' data, then you get the organizational trust where then you can they'll let you monkey around with their internal processes. Not completely, but they'll let you tweak some words on a form, right? And running field experiments it's a lot of work. You're getting a lot of trust and a lot of things can go wrong. So like putting that initial work in initially to show that we care about what they care about, that we can be trusted with their data, lets us run the field experiment, which is the true causal test, right? As fun as correlations are. So employees nominate their reviewers, right? Their manager, their reports, their peers, and each of those reviewers, we assign reviewers to condition at the reviewer level. So here, for example, I'm this person, I nominate my manager, my peers, my reports. And if I am a report to two different managers, then I am in the same condition for all of my reports, which means that someone is going to get feedback from multiple conditions, but this now means that we're not contaminating at the reviewer level. So if I'm writing reviews, all those reviews that I write will be at the same level, or same condition. And then we share them with employees. How much time do I have on this? So there's another paper I wrote for OBHCP, which is about measuring concreteness. I spent about 6 months asking everybody at Harvard I knew to tell me about data they had on concreteness and actionability. So this is people in Dan Gilbert's lab teaching folks how to play darts. This is Todd Rogers had a bunch of data of parents giving advice to middle school parents about how their students can improve. We had a bunch of 360 peer review data. Ashley Willens had some data on people giving advice on how to live a good life and live a happy life. So all these different actionability settings And we trained where humans had annotated actionability, and we trained a model to rate actionability based on these annotations. And so why do we do this action? Why do we use this algorithm? I think algorithms are very much a default for us CSS people, but like, what's the case for why we're not using humans here? Well, we want it to be scalable, right? It's a little cheaper once we build the model to apply to new text, right? We want to go measure 50,000 new reviews. We don't have to pay somebody. We don't have to get security clearance. But also we want it to be interpretable, right? Because humans, we don't know why humans are making their decisions. They're the ultimate black box, right? But if the algorithm can be built to be interpretable, then we can understand rules that we can give to MBA students. So we have this data set from a bunch of different settings. We're doing like really simple stuff. N-grams and lasso. Linear weights on words and phrases. And okay, so here are different settings. What else? Okay, so what's interesting when we started this project, I was really interested in concreteness. Not for the 360 reviews. I was doing a lot of work in online education, and I was interested in concreteness. And I looked. Oh, it turns out there's actually an existing measure of concreteness out there. But then you keep looking, and it turns out there's 8 different measures of concreteness out there, all of which claim to be the dictionary for concreteness. And the problem with these dictionaries is they imply a domain universality, right? There's one concreteness dictionary to rule them all, except there's 8 of them. And it turns out in our data set, in the advice data that I just showed you, but also in this online education data where we had people annotate the actionability of their plans for future learning in online courses, none of these measures have like any correlation. Some of them, like this Brisbane dictionary where individual words are rated, have a correlation of about like 0.15 with human ratings, but like the LIWC is just a disaster. Some of them are even negatively correlated with, not with the outcome of interest, with the measurement of concreteness, right? So this is again a lesson in interpretability, and this is what it looks like when you pull a dictionary off the shelf without validating it with human raters, right? So here's just one. We can look at this. This is Strategic Management Journal for the business school folks. A very well-cited paper. No validation in the paper. They just kind of grabbed some LIWC scores and said this is concreteness. And it's like you're just as likely to be negatively correlated with concreteness as you are positively, right? Each one of these bars is a different study from our meta-analysis, right? So that's one measure. Here are the measures that are working a little bit better. Like this MRC, this was done by some Canadians where they rated each, they had humans annotate 40,000 words individually. The Bootstrap was kind of based on this original dictionary, but it extrapolated to a little bit bigger setting. Sorry, so MTurk is the MTurk dictionary, that's the Canadian. This one was done by someone at Imperial, Lucis Specia. And it's sort of a related, it used this dictionary as a foundation, but bootstrapped it up. But for measurement validity, you want measurement validity to be higher than 0.2. You know, because otherwise you're never going to find your effect. You need, that's a hard ceiling on your power, right? So there's a lot of lessons to be learned about trust. One interesting thing about this is, do I have this slide? Oh yeah, the more you pay for the dictionary, the worse it is. So diction is $200 and is a disaster. LIWC is $95, and some of them are some of them are p less than 0.05, but the correlations are very small. So you know, get your own humans. Like it doesn't take that long to build a scale. In fact, I think I have this. So we had annotations for 3,000 of these advice, but we did a bunch of simulations saying, well, how good would we have, how many annotations would we have to train an n-gram lasso model that was better than the best existing dictionary? And here's the best existing dictionary. So you can get, if you have 1,000 annotations, you're doing better than the best existing dictionary. And like you can do 1,000 annotations in an afternoon if you have a co-author, right? Or a full day. Like sit down and read your data, right? People think that with NLP, it's like a substitute for reading. Like, oh, I'm going to get the machine to do my reading so I don't have to. No, it is a complement to reading, right? Because it makes your reading more powerful. If you're reading the text, then you can teach the machine to read the text just like you do, right? So NLP is not a replacement for reading. You're going to have to do more. But it's going to mean that you can have some impact. Anyway, so it turns out we do a pretty good job. This is cross-domain within the advice data sets. 2.228. We have our in our lab data set, we have our validity is a little higher. So here's in our lab data, our NLP measure of concreteness is correlated with the actionability of 0.43, usefulness of 0.36, developmental nature 0.23, not as good, but usefulness and actionability were our pre-registered ones that we cared most about. So it's not perfect. There's a lot of things that are subjective about advice and actionability, but in this case, we feel pretty good about using this as a measure. Yeah. Anyway, I have two R packages out, and this is one of them. So you can do, again, to have impact. So one is the politeness package for measuring a bunch of dialogue act features, but this one we just wanted to put out these models. So we trained one for advice, we trained one for plan making, and then we have this general domain best dictionary available approach with a couple of tweaks. And these are fun. I mean, you know, you got to post your code anyway, but for writing production ready code, you know, it's a nice way to connect folks. Every time I go to a conference, I meet somebody who uses my code I'd never even met before, right? So it's like, again, building the network and having a little bit of an impact. Okay, so let's interpret it. So here are the words and phrases that are indicating abstract input. It's a lot of generic pronouns, a lot of empty platitudes, a lot of positivity. So in the case with like the gender bias and actionability, the problem is people talk about this as this idea of benevolent sexism. So instead of giving you the actionable feedback that will actually let you get better at your job, they give you a lot of empty nice. They say a lot of empty nice things. You know, just keep being you. You're doing great. Right? If you don't have something useful to say, just say something nice. But actionable input has a lot of the words that we'd expect, right? Do more of this, less of that. You need to do this. I mean, it's different for every task, right? The nouns, the content words aren't coming through with the n-grams, but the structure of how we frame actionable advice seems to be pretty reliable across all these different advice settings. And so here, because it's an n-gram, because it's a lasso model, I can show you the entire model on this one plot. This looks so interpretable, right? But each one of these points is a coefficient in our model, and lasso is just regression, so it's word frequency times the coefficient, and so the coefficient is here, so the words on the far right are more actionable, the ones on the far left are less actionable, and then the ones that are really common are up here, right? So we see a lot of phrases that make a lot of sense to us, right? Be specific, do this instead, you should do this, work on that. So we see this in our examples that I showed you before, right? So the low actionability ones are a lot of like generic stuff, a lot of focus on yourself rather than the other person, talking about feelings, a lot of compliments instead of actionability, right? Whereas the high actionability stuff uses the kind of phrases that we'd expect based on the model. So our field study, you want to give it a bigger effect in the field because you only have one shot at it. So we manipulated our mediator as well as our IV. So we didn't just change feedback and advice, we kind of changed the structure of the sentence too. But again, along the same dimension of past versus future focus. We also did this, we had another intervention we tried, which is this idea of radical candor. We told people, like, I don't know if you guys have heard this in the workplace, like, this person's expecting your candid responses, give as direct and honest feedback as you can. This actually didn't make anything more actionable, but it did make the advice recipient feel less motivated. So not a great day for radical candor. I mean, this could be different in different settings. You know, there could be some finance, Silicon Valley examples where radical candor will motivate those kinds of people. But in the British government, this kind of turns you off from work and it doesn't make the output any more helpful. Okay, so let's get to our graph. So yeah, candor didn't really improve anything. Advice improved things across both conditions. So here's a regression. We have a bunch of controls across all of our models. We find that advice makes things more actionable compared to the control. Well, we benchmarked this. So again, interpretability. How big is this treatment effect? Well, we looked at other existing treatment effects that are known in the literature, right? So here's our gender effect, right? So men are getting somewhat more actionable feedback than women. And our treatment effect is slightly bigger than that, right? So a woman in the advice treatment is getting more actionable feedback than a man in the control treatment. Again, it's two main effects, so the most actionable is men in the future focus, but gives you a sense of how big this effect is. It's not huge, right? But we're also changing a tiny little thing on the form, right? There's no cost to how you phrase that 360 peer review form. So why not do it a better way? And then we know that people who are worse at their jobs get more actionable feedback. So the effect is about not quite a half of just being one standard deviation worse at your job. And then managers obviously consistent with theory, managers give much more actionable feedback than to their reports than the reports give up to their managers. Which, that's a big effect, but it's also a sanity check, right? It gives you more feeling better that our measures are measuring what we're claiming they're measuring. Here's the gender effect. This is an interesting one. So we're thinking about what to do about the second paper. Part of the reason women get less actionable feedback on average is because the civil service is something like 64% men. But men give more, so men give much more actionable feedback to other men, and much less actionable feedback to women. But if you only look at female advice givers, they actually give more actionable feedback to women rather than men give back to men. We have some initial hypotheses about this, but part of it's actually just, I think, just a general sense of similarity. So if you look at people in the same department, people from the same ethnic background, you see a similar pattern, which is people give more actionable feedback to other folks that they think are more similar. And so maybe there's a comfort level involved. We're trying to unpack this. We have some lab experiment ideas. Yeah, we've been busy. We have other papers. Ariel has had a couple of kids. But we're getting there. This is something we really want to work on. So if you have ideas, please let us know. And theoretically, that was the problem we were supposed to be solving at the beginning, right? Okay, so let me skip through this. We have some theory. Let's get to some questions. Oh, there's one thing I want to show you from this study, which I think is a underrated aspect. So often it happens in psychology or economics. You have this idea and people are like, oh, so what? Like, isn't this obvious? Some of you have maybe gotten this before. So there's this little trick we do, and almost all of my papers have some study of this version, which is called the broken mental model study. And it's okay if people have different preferences. Maybe they don't want to be actionable for some reason. Or they have other goals that they're maximizing instead. But what is not okay, what is clearly a violation of sort of a rational model of organizational cognition, is that people should have correct beliefs about the effects of their choices, right? And so when you show the broken mental model study, what you're showing is that people are making a mistake in the field, right? They're not getting what they claim to be measured. They get it. So in the broken mental model study, we did this twice. So once we had, we asked people on Prolific who were full-time employees to write us an email in the survey to their supervisor asking for thoughts on an upcoming task. And then we just looked at the email and looked whether they used the word feedback or advice. And half the people used the word feedback, less than 10% used the word advice. There were some other words in here. Thoughts was pretty high. That's why we use thoughts as our control condition in that other study, right? But we're showing naturally expressing, people are not seeking advice. So isn't this obvious? Well, not obvious to them. Sorry, one second. Let me show you the other panel here. Then Ariella got a bunch of her MBA students at Columbia to look. These are post-experience MBAs, so they've already been in the workforce for 2 years. And so we asked them to look back through their employee logs and see when's the last time they got a developmental feedback, like one of these 360 peer reviews or an annual report or something, and just said, what are the employers using in their forms to elicit developmental input? And here, 97% are asking for feedback. About half are asking for advice. Some are asking for both in the form, but again, this suggests that there's a mistake being made out in the market, right? If these exercises are purely developmental, not about evaluating for promotion or raises, but simply helping people be better at their job, that people are making this mistake. And so no reviewer two, this is not obvious. So this is kind of and these are super cheap studies to run. So it's a kind of a fun tag. Yeah, a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, it's fascinating that under you find this women are especially hard on women connected, especially when there's a back to their younger point. Because I had a part back in the day. I'm in the past generation, so I don't want to be and anyone with biases. And there's nothing going with that, that's a bad part, even if that does, that I've heard from, I wonder if it's like that. And then the other part, extremely hierarchical, are right to governments. Set out, there are
Yes.
stages,
Yes.
right, so I guess we look very different, I think it's always the case in fairness. But there is also, I mean, I've worked in public service before as well, that for instance, the moment you have promotion, you will not get good feedback by default because they will base you down. And then the next thing you can get again, better feedback. So I wonder if you condition on some things like that. Or if you have made up that is first time promotion or how is this looking? I don't know. I am coming more thoughts, but yeah, I just
Please, let me address the thoughts you have. On. We might be able to back out recent promotions because we have 2 years of data, so we can see if the same employee has a different pay scale. So that's something we can get to. On the women being hard on other women. So. I want to challenge your premise a little bit because sometimes you need a little bit of tough love, and that's kind of the problem here. Now, being hard, in addition to the open-ended text box, we also have performance, like numeric performance ratings. There's like 2 pages of like, this person is punctual, this person is like, contributes good ideas, right? All these numeric scales 1 to 7. And so women don't actually give harder ratings on the numeric stuff. So when we control for performance ratings, that's what we're doing, looking at the numeric stuff. And it's not just that one person, we can look at performance rating by everybody else who rated them. So the gender bias, that sort of flip, doesn't appear in the numeric ratings, which I think, I don't know if that's consistent or not with your theory, but I think speaks to something, it's certainly not women keeping other women down. Now, what we haven't done is we haven't looked at seniority, how that interacts with the gender thing. Yeah, and the way you phrase that makes me really think that we should. So can you check back with me in like 2 or 3 weeks? I'm gonna see Ariel at a conference in July, so we're definitely gonna have it by then. But that's a really good idea. Thank you. Anything else on this? Yeah, please.
That's no data. I noticed a lot of the rating and also feedbacks in the comments. You have metadata, the location, you have the income and so on.
Interesting. So I have spent some time with Glassdoor data. With notes from my class, you did a project with Glassdoor data, right? Yeah, an award-winning project. That was great. That feedback comment, I don't know how much of that is genuine, helpful advice and more like venting and the framing of advice, like, I highly recommend they not be such jerks. So it's not strictly a developmental setting, right? Because I'm giving advice to you, but I'm talking to everyone else about it. You could be, my reading, have you spent much time with that data set?
A bit, and some of them quite useful. I also got the rating from other people.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of, I'm not saying that for data that there's too much time.
We haven't dug too deep. We haven't looked at the Glassdoor data much from the advice lens, but you're right, there really could be something there. I am a petty man, and I come from such a micro behavioral economics framework that I really want to understand an individual's incentives and goals. When I look at the data, I think from a more macro perspective, some of those distinctions can maybe be papered over. And I'm not saying that the macro people don't have a lot of interesting things to say. It's just that I'm a consumer of that literature, but not as much a producer. I mean, I could probably give you some thoughts if you want to follow up. If you have the data, maybe you should do this. My R package, you can download it in 1 line of code. Well, I'm not going to go all the way back, but you get it. I like the idea. Yeah. You'd want to look across many different companies, right? Because that's the heterogeneity. that would be of interest, right? And I guess you don't have any information on the people's managers, right? So it wouldn't be relevant for this project, but you had a bigger idea about maybe current employees give more actionable feedback than former employees. Yeah, we could probably generate some interesting hypotheses. You guys are doing independent projects next week, so. You know, if any of this seeps into that, teaching that Friday, but I could come by, or we could talk about it later. I mean, I like the idea, I like the idea. Let me finish up. We have all these future directions. Okay, there's no LLMs. This is like super basic Enneagram stuff. But we are now working with this company called Assistments. Some folks I know from back in my Boston early on an education days. It's like automated homework. These kids these days, it's incredible. So they do all their homework through apps, and like the apps will farm out their written assignments to teachers who are paid to grade. But they also have LLMs doing the grading too. And the LLMs are almost as good as, or like basically as good as the teachers now in terms of like the kids' reports, in terms of correlations. LLMs agree with humans as much as humans agree with each other, which is always my standard for like good quality NLP. And so we're going to run a field experiment with them. They're doing it with like tens of thousands of kids. And we're using the LLMs, we're teaching the LLMs to either do future focused advice or past focused feedback. And the nice thing about that setting is now, because the kids are doing homework problems every week on the same app, you know, the big problem with this paper is we don't measure performance, right? We don't measure whether this actually improves their job. We just look at whether the advice gets better, or whether people think it's useful. With the kids, maybe future focused advice actually ideally makes them better at next week's homework, but I'll be happy if it just makes them more likely to complete next week's homework, or just do more optional problems. Like there's a motivation benefit of future focus. But that's kind of the next step of where we're going. And it's so many LLMs you won't even believe. So
You know that the kids.
I don't know that they don't use it. Well, that would be conservative, because if they're just using LLMs to do their homework, then there's not going to be any treatment effect of the feedback, right? So now our LLMs are motivating their LLMs.
Yeah, and you can.
Oh, delicious.
Whole lap.
Well, that would make them better at the assignment. That wouldn't necessarily make them want to complete more optional problems, right? Because if they're cheating and they're just trying to get out of their homework, then they're not going to do the optional problems. So we're going to measure motivation through the use of optional problems, but then also the effect on performance through the next. I mean, it's a good question. Mostly this is not my problem. This is these teachers' problems. Education is a minefield. I don't know what they're doing in there. I let my students just use LLMs willy-nilly. I'm just happy if it's competent. But for folks in middle school, boy, it's a good thought. But I think hopefully some of that will wash out in the randomization. I'm not going to send too panicky an email to Neil about that, but we are going to think about that. Okay, what a world. I love all these people. They're amazing. Georgie and Hannah especially are industry partners. You got to have your champion on the inside. So we spent a lot of time working with them. And Ariel is going to be on the job market. Yeomans in industry. Actually just got tenure. Haley is doing great. We're a long way away from tenure. But yeah. Anyway, so I do a bunch of stuff on conversations. I think it's really interesting. I think about the conversation as a unit of relationships, a really fascinating window into micro stuff. So I have a theory paper about the different goals people have in conversation. I don't want to do this economic rational actor thing of just assuming people's goals. Just because they're not pursuing your goals doesn't mean they're not maximizing their conversation behavior. It's hard to prove people are making mistakes. We have the first theory paper ever written on conversation, and then we have this is like a review paper of every mistake we've ever made analyzing dialogue data, and all in one place, from like where to put the microphones when you're recording people to like how to anonymize the data so you can share it in open science. Conversation is cumulative because you can test so many different hypotheses with the same data, right? And we're all talking with each other. So I think it's a fascinating space. And we don't think about it much. We usually think about single author text, like product reviews or newspaper articles. But most language is people talking to each other. So hopefully you guys find that as fascinating as I do. This has been a lot of single author talking today. Not as interactive as I would have liked, but this time I'll wrap it up now. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, everyone. Questions? Maybe? You guys want lunch?